warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies. We would like to extend you a warm welcome to our event, Seminars dan Kuliah Umum or SinarKU, held by EQUITAS, Equitable Transformation for Alleviating Poverty and Inequality Working Group, in collaboration with the Laboratory of Economics, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Gadjah Mada. Today's SinarKU session will feature our remarkable speaker, Professor Agustin Samano Penaloza, a research economist in the Microeconomics and Growth Team of the World Bank's Development Research Group. Our deepest gratitude goes to all of our participants today. For the next 2 hours, we will learn together about our main theme of the effect of fiscal rules on long-term growth. I am Afifah Putri, one of the assistants from EQUITAS Working Group, and I will be your master of ceremony for today. Before we begin, I would like to take a few moments to explain the rules of the games for today's event. First, this event is carried out in an offline manner. Second, this event has two main sessions, a 90-minute lecture followed by a question and answer session for 15 to 30 minutes. Third, if any participants has a question related to the material being delivered, the participant can ask the question during the Q&A session by raising their hand. Fourth, all participants are expected to be polite, courteous, and to not mention any discriminatory element in conveying questions or opinions. Lastly, fifth, participants are entitled to get an e-certificate if they participate in SinarKU to the end and fill in attendance and feedback, which will be given at the end of the event. Those are the rules of the games for today's event. We hope that all attendees can adhere to these rules properly. I also would like to elaborate the rundown for today's event. First is the opening of the event. Second, the seminar session from our professor. Third, the question and answer session. And lastly, the closing of the event. Without further ado, let's start this session by inviting everyone to stand up for our anthem Indonesia Raya, followed by singing to our hymn Gadjah Mada. Before going into our main sessions, we will sing the national anthem of the Republic of Indonesia and Gadjah Mada hymn. For all attendees, please rise. Thank you, everyone, and please take your seat. For the next agenda, we are going to listen to the lectures under the theme The Effect of Fiscal Rules on Long-Term Growth, delivered by Professor Agustin Penaloza. Before we go into the sessions, please let me introduce our moderator for today, Mr. Gunawan. Mr. Gunawan is a lecturer from the Department of Economics, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Gadjah Mada. In 2009, he earned his bachelor's degree from the Humboldt University of Berlin, and he earned his master's degree from the same university in 2012. Recently, he earned his doctoral degree from the University of Kansas, the United States. Additionally, he takes expertises on financial economics and time series forecasting. Without further ado, we will hand over today's event to be immediately hosted by Mr. Gunawan. To Mr. Gunawan, the floor is yours.
I don't have the CV of the speaker. Okay, good morning, everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us today for today's seminar with our distinguished guest, Mr. Agustin Samano. So he is a research economist at the World Bank Group. If I'm not mistaken, his expertise area is fiscal and monetary policy in emerging economies. So his educational background, so he earned his bachelor's degree in 2015 from Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. And then from in 2017, he earned his master's degree in economics from University of Minnesota. And 3 years ago, he just earned his doctorate in economics from the same university. His, yeah. Um, Now I'll sit here. Now I would like to welcome Professor Samano on the podium. I think we'll just share a microphone. Um, okay, before we start, I'd like to give some context into what we're going to talk about today. It's based on a news headlines that I saw on Instagram like last week before the inauguration of our new president. So the news said that during the last 10 years of our former president's administration, President Joko Widodo, um, as per January 2024, our public debt has actually increased by 224%, or in terms of rupiah, it was 6 quadrillion rupiah. So it's 6 million, no, 6,000 trillion rupiah. And in terms of our GDP, it was roughly 39%. So we kind of knew, so we've been following the news, so we kind of knew where the money went. So our country has never seen such a huge or massive scale of infrastructure building. So we have so many new airports, so many seaports, um, toll roads, um, and then a bunch of social programs, subsidies, and also not to mention the construction of our new capital, IKN, Ibu Kota Nusantara. Well, yeah, so this rapid accumulation of public debt, accompanied by not so aggressive, so relatively not so aggressive tax revenue increase, has actually sparked a debate. So, is it good? Is it good for our long-term economic growth, or probably is it bad? So, is it posing some risk into our economic stability in the long run? Well, these are some of the key questions that we will dig deep. Um, Fiscal rules and debt limits play a crucial role in shaping how economies evolve, and understanding their long term impact is actually essential, especially for countries facing sovereign risk and capital constraints. So, with this context in mind, we're excited to have Agustin and to hear from him, who will share his research and shed some light into these important questions. I hope that this seminar will deepen our understanding of how fiscal policies can shape the future of our economies. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Agustin Samano.
Thank you very much for having me here. Should we start? Okay. Let me stand up. Thank you very much. Um, Perfect. So let me just set expectations. This is um, academic paper, so it can be a little bit dense in maths and equations, but equations is just what I need so the referees can publish this paper. What is important is the idea, so I'm gonna try to focus on that. Um, so let me just start by telling you how I start this project with my friend from the PhD, and now he's a assistant professor at Rogers University, Carlos Esquivel. Um, so one day I was talking with government counterparts from the Ministry of Finance in the Philippines, and you know the Philippines is one of the countries that during COVID the debt in the Philippines increased around 18 points of GDP, right? So they were worried about debt on sustainability, which means that at some point they cannot pay back debt, right? So what they were asking is, okay, how can we achieve fiscal consolidation, which means how can we reduce debt levels without sacrificing economic growth, right? I'm gonna tell you a little bit more about this trade-off. But basically, when they told me this, I start thinking about it, and then I talk with my friend, and then we decide to come up with this paper. Um, and basically, what we're gonna show you is that fiscal rules may contribute not only to achieve fiscal discipline, which is something that has been already studied in the literature, but also it could contribute to attract investment and boost economic growth in the medium and the long run. So let me, I mean, this is the idea that if your mom asks you, what did you learn today? You just need to say that. So after this, you can fall asleep if you want. Um, so as I was saying, the motivation is how to achieve fiscal consolidation without sacrificing economic growth. And basically, the trade-off that has been already studied in the literature is that if you want fiscal consolidation, basically it means that you need to increase taxes or you need to reduce spending. And usually, either increasing taxes or reducing spending is associated with a drop in economic activity in the short run. On the other hand, you have the benefit of having healthy public finance, which could contribute to have higher GDP and higher investment in the medium and long run. So basically, what we're gonna do is we're gonna put this trade-off in an economic model. So the question is, could fiscal rules contribute to achieving expansionary fiscal consolidation? It means a fiscal consolidation that contribute to economic growth. And basically, what we're gonna show is that in the short run, there's gonna be a small contraction, but in the long run, you can achieve higher investment and lower sovereign spreads if you impose a debt limit. So I'm gonna show you this. Um, so basically, what I'm gonna do in this paper, or what we do in this paper, is first we provide empirical observation. Basically, we document that fiscal rules are positive correlated with private investment, right? I'm gonna show you first like a panel regression in which I show you that countries that have a fiscal rule have on average higher investment than countries without a rule. And then I also gonna do like a local projection impulse response function analysis to show how after the adoption of fiscal rules, we observe an increase in private investment. Then we're gonna build a sovereign debt model that will try to rationalize this positive correlation between fiscal rules and private investment. Um, and basically, the mechanism behind our result is that fiscal rules contribute to two things. So basically, countries like Indonesia, like Mexico, that face higher interest rates than advanced economies, right? We call these sovereign spreads. So countries that face sovereign spreads basically face two problems. One is underinvestment, right? Because if the interest rates in our countries are higher than in advanced economies, this will lead um, underinvestment relative to what will be optimal if there is no sovereign spreads, right? Um, and then the other problem is that when you issue long-term debt, basically you decrease the value of the debt today. So basically, this is something that is called in the literature debt dilution, right? And if you put a fiscal rule, basically you reduce debt dilution and also increase investment. And basically, that's why we find that in the model, fiscal rules contribute to have more investment and more growth. But this is just like a preview. I will explain you this in detail. Um, so basically, the main findings of the paper is that the optimal debt limit with commitment reduce default risk, right? Um, then at the beginning, as I say, there will be a contraction in the economy because at the beginning, when you just adopt a fiscal rule, you have to pay back debt, you have to reduce debt. So that means that you will have less money for investment, for consumption. So there's going to be a contraction in the economy. But in the medium and long term, there's going to be an expansion because overall you're going to face lower interest rates, higher investment, and higher capital accumulation and higher growth. So I'm going to show you that commitment plays a key role. So it's very important that the lenders and the private sector believe believe that I'm gonna comply with the fiscal rule. Um, and we also show that without commitment, the mechanism still hold, but the welfare gains are lower, right? So I'm gonna talk more about that. Um, so let me skip this part and let me start with the with empirical motivation. So basically, the first thing that we do is just panel regression, taking data for 62 or 68 emerging economies, right? Basically, we use data for private investment. There is a typo there. Is data for private investment from the IMF Capital Stock Database. We use also the IMF fiscal rules dataset. So basically, we're gonna have a this is can I doesn't have a pointer, right? Does it? Oh, sorry. Okay, so so we're gonna regress so the dependent variable will be the investment to GDP, right? Which gonna get data from the investment and capital. Oh my God, investment and capital stock database from the IMF. Then we're gonna have a dummy for 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 dead rule. So it's gonna be 1 if there is a if there is a dead rule in country I at period T. Then RS will be sovereign spreads. Um, then we also gonna control by public debt normalized by GDP, and basically we're gonna control by the cyclical component of GDP. So this regression, basically the right hand side of the equation are all variables that we're gonna find in a theoretical model, right? And basically what we get by running this, if you look at the specification number 4, so we got a positive correlation between debt rule and private investment. So this means that countries that have uh, um, a debt rule on average have like 1.4 points of GDP higher investment than countries without a rule. We also find that countries with we also find that lower spreads are correlated with um, higher investment, right? So lower spreads is mean that the low interest rate are lower, so there are more resources for investment, thus investment increase. Um, DGDY is the public debt. So public debt is also negative correlated with investment, right? The more debt the country has, usually the less investment. And this is something known as the crowding out effect of public debt. In this case, for specification number 4, is not statistically significant, but the signs are correct. And finally, the GDPCC is the cyclical component of GDP, which is positive correlated with private investment, right? So all signs are as expected. And basically, what I want you to take from this is that using a panel regression across 69 emerging economies, we find a positive correlation between having a fiscal rule and higher private investment. Okay, so we also do that um, using spreads as as um, as dependent variable, and actually I have another paper on that. And basically, we also find that having a debt rule contribute to have lower spreads. Okay. Um, Finally, we also, because basically this is sorry, no, how can I go back? Can I go back to the regressions? I think I know how. Thank you. So basically, this is a panel data regression using data from 2000 to 2019. And what this is telling you is that on average, countries with the debt rule have higher private investment, right, as percentage of GDP. But it's not telling you anything about the transition when the countries adopt the fiscal rule. So to do that, we did something that is called local projection analysis. And basically, what we do is just we run the same regression, right? But for different time horizons. So basically, we change the dependent variable depending the time horizon, and we estimate a beta associated with the dead rule for each time horizon for how. So instead of using the dummy variable of whether you have a dead rule or not, we create a variable that basically it tells you whether you adopt a fiscal rule or not. What does this mean? For example, in the case of Indonesia, that Indonesia adopt a debt rule in 2004. So if you look at this variable, basically you will have 0 in 2000, 0 in 2001, 0, 0. And then in 2004, you will have a 1. And then 2005, 6 until 2019, you will have zeros, right? So what we want to capture with that is just the fiscal shock of adopting a fiscal rule. So basically, uh, we estimate the effect of the debt rule adoption on private investment 1 year after the adoption, 2 years after the adoption, 3 years after the adoption, until 5 years or 6 years after the adoption of the fiscal rule. So basically, this is what we find. So let me see if I can use this. Oh my God, my hand is moving. Okay. Yeah, no, I cannot do this. Sorry. So basically, in period zero is the moment of the debt rule adoption. This is not only for Indonesia. This is the average of all the countries that between 2003 and 2014 they adopt a fiscal rule. So we have around like 13 countries that between that period adopt a fiscal rule. So, for example, in period zero, basically we have the beta estimate is around -1. So basically it means that the adoption of the fiscal rule decrease investment in the period of the adoption, right? Then 1 year after the adoption of the rule, still investment is negative, so investment decrease. And then after year no, 2 or 3, it start increasing, right? Um, I mean, this is not really statistically significant. If you look at the confidence interval, is around zero all the time, right? Which means that it's not statistically significant. But this is also because we don't have that many episodes, right? But what we like about this result, just as a motivation of our analysis, is that the dynamic of investment after the adoption of fiscal rule captures the idea that we want to model. That in the short run, it might decrease investment a little bit, but then it will increase. And the idea is at the beginning, if you adopt a fiscal rule, probably you need a period of fiscal consolidation. You need to reduce spending. You need to increase taxes, and this might decrease investment. But then once that you recover, you experiment again high levels of investment, and basically this is something that we're gonna be able to capture with the model. So how many minutes do I still have? Oh my God. Okay. Then I will sit because um okay. So hopefully you have the big picture uh, by now, because if you didn't understood that, you will not understood this. So this is just basically the model that I'm gonna use to show that fiscal rules can contribute to increase capital accumulation and economic growth in the medium and long run. Or other way to say is that I want to build a model that basically replicate the facts that I just tell you, which is the positive correlation between fiscal rules or debt rules and investment. So this is something that is called sovereign debt models. Is anyone here familiar with sovereign debt models? Raise your hand. Okay, great. Perfect. So basically, I gonna tell you the summary of sovereign debt models. Basically, the good thing about sovereign debt models is that these are models that can endogenize the simultaneously the dynamics of public debt and sovereign spreads and the probability of default. So basically, something that we observed in the data like 20 years ago, it was that emerging markets, basically, when they increase the public debt, basically the interest rate also increase with it, right? Um, and if you issue a lot of debt, then your interest rate will increase a lot, um, because basically the interest rate is capturing the probability that you're gonna default on your debt, right? And 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 if you keep increasing the debt, eventually you will default. So basically, emerging economies um, face this constraint because they cannot issue as much debt as they would like, right? And I was talking with your professor that basically, if you look at the public debt levels in economies like the US, Japan, so public debt levels in these countries represent more than 100% of the GDP. But for countries, for emerging economies like Indonesia, like Mexico, um, we cannot sustain very high levels of debt because then markets and investors gonna start thinking that eventually you will not be able to repay debt and you're gonna default. And if I believe that, then I gonna want more return to buy your bonds. So you have to pay me a higher interest rate. But if you have to pay me a higher interest rate every time that you want to issue more debt, eventually it will be true that um, you cannot actually pay back your debt or you cannot sustain that. So for emerging economies, like debt sustainability represent an issue because basically in bad times we cannot issue as much debt as we would like to because basically the financial markets will and the investors will penalize you. So basically, these models can basically internalize the probability of default that is reflected in the sovereign spreads. So let me just describe the economy quickly. So this is gonna be a small open economy with a continuum of households, one competitive firm, and a benevolent government. Um, do you understand what these three things mean? Raise your hand if you understand. What is a continuum of households? What is a benevolent government? Okay, I will explain. Uh, so a small open economy basically is an economy that you don't need to satisfy the condition that consumption is equal endowment, right? You can export, you can import. Continuum of households is that you're gonna have many households, but they will have exactly the same preferences. You only gonna have also one firm that's gonna represent the private sector, and benevolent government is basically a government that will have exactly the same preferences as the households. So this is gonna be the preference of the household. Um, this is something very standard. I will not stop there that much. Households own the firm and the capital, and households are the ones making the investment decisions. And an important assumption is that they cannot borrow from abroad. Only the government can borrow on behalf of the households. Um, and the government have also the possibility of default on their debt, right? Which this is something typical in sovereign debt models. And basically, the firms rents the capital and produce with this technology. Okay, and here we have a uncertainty in the economy in the sense that we have productivity shock, which is represented by Z, and basically it's just a AR1 process. So the idea of this is that you don't know exactly what will be your productivity tomorrow, and if you have a lot of debt and you get a bad productivity shock tomorrow, probably you will not be able to pay your debt, right? So you can think about the productivity shock as, oh, maybe COVID happened, or oh, maybe another external shock happened, and then this will increase the production in the economy. So sorry, let me talk a little bit about the fiscal side. So we're gonna have long-term debt, which is that I issue debt today, but I don't need to pay everything tomorrow. Only tomorrow I only have to pay gamma, right? So long-term debt that matures at rate gamma. Um, um, and basically this is the law of motion of debt. So basically, the debt tomorrow will be equal to whatever I issue, which is IBT, the debt that I issue at period T, and whatever I issue in the past and it hasn't matured, which is 1 minus gamma times B. So the government budget constraint is basically given by the right hand side is the revenues. So I can get revenues from issuing debt, right? Um, but I need to pay back this amount of debt. The um, this is what I have to pay back today. This is what I can issue today, and basically these are the either taxes or transferences that I give to the households, right? If it's positive, is a lump sum transfer that I give to the household. If it's negative, it's a tax that I take from the household. And basically, the way that we model the debt limit is just by saying, okay, the debt limit will be the maximum of these two, which basically what this is say, what this is saying is that so the debt should be like she amount of the output, right? Or if I'm above that limit, then I cannot issue more debt, right? So it's either two things. Like you can think about the debt limit just as a number. Let's say in the case of Indonesia, I think is 60% of GDP. So what our rule is saying is that okay, the debt rule should be either 60% of GDP or a primary deficit of zero if you are above the 60% of GDP, right? So in case that the debt is higher than 60%, then the limit is that you cannot have a primary deficit, or the primary deficit should be zero. This is just like a technical stuff that help to model what we are doing. Um, so what is interesting in these models is that the government can default. So if the government decide to default, basically there's gonna be like exogenous default cost, right? So the productivity will be lower, right? And this is meant to capture the idea that what we observe in the data is that when countries default on their debt, right? You can think about Argentina in 2004, Mexico in 2000, in 1995, um, Greece in 2012. What we observe is that when countries default, also the output suffers a drop. So this is just to capture the idea that okay, when economies default, then the productivity will drop as well. Um, and basically, when the governments default, we also assume that governments are excluded from financial markets, but there is a probability to re-entry to the financial markets. which is captured by theta. And whenever you go back to the financial markets, your initial level of debt will be BT equal to 0. Um, so I'm almost finished with this part. Um, so the timing is that, imagine at the beginning of the period, the government observes the state of the economy, which basically is given by the shock and by the initial level of debt, right? And then, given the shock of the economy, so the government decide the fiscal policy. Let's say the government decide the amount of debt, the new amount of debt, the amount of taxes or transfers, right? Then the household observe the policy decisions, which is represented by GT, and then the household make consumption and investment decisions. And once this happen, basically the lenders observe the fiscal policy, which is captured by GT, the aggregate investment of the economy, which is made by the households, but based on what the fiscal policy is, right? This is important. And and basically lenders observe this and they price the debt, right? So the idea of the last 3 4 slides is that if if the households are investing a lot, it means that the economy gonna be growing fast, and basically the country will be richer, and the government will be more capable of paying back debt. So if lenders can anticipate that, they're gonna give you a good price for your debt. So that means that they gonna give you a low interest rate, right? Um, but then all this depend on the fiscal policy, right? Because if the government want to issue a lot of debt and want to tax a lot, right? Then the households will not invest that much, right? And then if they don't invest that much, then the interest rate probably will be higher, and then um, it's gonna be harder for the government to pay back debt. So what I just want to emphasize with this is that all these decisions, so fiscal policy, investment decisions, and the price of debt are highly correlated. Okay, and this is important. Um, so this is just something so you get bored. Um, I'm joking. So this is just the problem that the households have to solve, right? This is what I put in the computer. I don't gonna bore you with this. This is the problem that the households have to solve. Basically, what this is saying is that the government, the not the government, the household basically is choosing the consumption, investment, and capital, and they have a lot of constraints, and they also have to take into account the policy functions. Sorry, they have to take into account the fiscal policy, as I mentioned in the previous slide. But let me skip this part. Um, so the households have to solve a problem when the government repays. They have to also solve a problem when the government defaults, right? And the solution of that problem, for example, in this case, will be given by policy functions for consumption, for investment, and for capital. Um, then the government has to do the same. So let me tell you a little bit about the government problem that might be easier to follow. So when the government is in good standing, which basically means that the government choose to repay debt, um, the next last period, the next period they have to, or this period they have to make the following decision. They they decide whether to default or to repay. So if they choose D equal to 1, then they're gonna default. If they choose D equal to 0, they're gonna repay. Okay. Um, so if the government default, then the value of default is given by this expression, which basically is telling you the value of you defaulting is equal to the utility that the consumption today gives you, right? Plus the future utility, and that will depend on whether you get access to debt markets again, or if you remain in autarky after default. And if the government decide to repay, then the value function is given by the expression below, which by this. So basically saying that if you decide to repay, then you get to choose the new fiscal policy, basically to maximize utility today and the future utility. And you basically you need to you are facing the budget constraint, right? Um, so this is the economy, right? And basically the equilibrium for this economy is given by value, policy, and beliefs functions for households, value and fiscal policy functions for the government, and a price schedule such that households, government, and lenders all solve their problems optimally, right? Um, so let me go to some figures so you don't get that bored. Let me skip this. Okay. So basically, I put this model in the computer, right? Um, we put this model on my computer, or my co-author put the model in the computer, and then so we need to calibrate the model. What does calibration means? It means that we need to discipline some of the parameters of the model using data, right? As I was telling you, your professors, that like the first version of this paper, which was like probably 1 year ago, um, I convinced my co-author to calibrate the model to Indonesia because we know that Indonesia adopted a fiscal rule in 2004. Um, but then we present this paper in many forums, and because in Indonesia there have not been default episodes, sometimes people in the literature they ask, "Oh, why Indonesia?" So we decide to calibrate the model for Argentina. Um, so basically, we calibrate the model for Argentina, which has no debt limit, and basically the exercise that we're gonna do is to show. Basically, the exercise that we're gonna show is like, okay, let's calibrate the model for Argentina. Let's assume that this economy is Argentina, and let's see what will happen if Argentina adopt a fiscal rule. So that is a little bit of the exercise that we're gonna do. Um, so the first thing that we do is to compute what will be the optimal debt limit um, for this economy. Again, this is for our calibrated economy, which represents Argentina. It doesn't mean that this should be the optimal limit for all economies, right? But depending on your levels of debt, depending on your spreads, depending on your GDP growth process, we can compute the optimal level for a specific economy. And in the case of Argentina, we get that the optimal debt limit is around 44.2% of GDP, right? And what I want you to see in this figure, uh, which represent the welfare gains, is that in the case of the optimal debt limit, the welfare gains is around 0.5 percent more consumption every period, right? It looks like a small number, but is really not that small. It represents like you have a 0.5% each quarter, right? Um, and this is a number that is standard in the literature. But what I want you to see is that what happened with the debt limit is too stringent, and what happened with the debt limit is too high, right? So when the debt limit is 44.2, yeah, so when the debt limit is 44.2, so the welfare gains is around 0.5%, right? But what happened when the debt limit is around 0.35 or 35% of GDP? Then the debt limit, the welfare gains are negative. So what this means? It means that if you impose a debt limit that is too stringent, right? Then because the government has to pay back debt, then they need to tax a lot the economy. Then this gonna constrain investment. This gonna constrain consumption, and basically you, the households and the country overall will be worse off, right? Is that clear? This is the part that you really need to understand, that if you put a very stringent debt limit, it's gonna be very painful for the economy, right? Imagine today that the Indonesian government decide to put a debt limit of 20% of GDP. So if the debt limit right now is 40, sorry, if the debt level today is around 44% or something like that, if you have to reduce this, if you have to reduce debt to 20 by 2024 points of GDP, it will be very painful because it means that the government has to tax more. It will means that the government has to spend less. It will means that um, the private sector will have to pay more taxes, less investment, less consumption. So this will be painful for the economy, even though it will be good for public finance. No. On the other hand, when the debt limit is to lakh, um, then there will not be welfare gains because basically it could be the case that the debt limit has no effect on investors' expectations and on main macroeconomic variables. So this is the interesting thing about this trade-off, that when you want to set a debt rule, it cannot be too stringent, but it cannot be too high, too lax. Okay, is this picture clear? This is an important picture. So basically, what we do now is that, okay, we're gonna do a exercise in which we're gonna simulate economy that didn't have a fiscal rule, and then they adopt the optimal fiscal rule that I just showed you, um, the one of 44.2% of GDP. So what happened to main macroeconomic variables? So again, zero. Sorry. Yes. What's your measure of welfare gains in do you want to use this?
So I just had a spontaneous question on your previous graph. So what is your measure of welfare gains in this picture? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So the way that I measure welfare gains is something that it's called a, it was a measure developed by Bob Lucas, um, and it's a consumption equivalent welfare. So basically, what it means is that you take two economies, one with the fiscal rule, one without the fiscal rule, and basically you compare the lifetime utility of the household in these two economies, and then you ask how much extra consumption should I give to the guys in the economy without rule, so they are indifferent, or they are as good as the guys in the economy with fiscal rule, right? So if that the consumption equivalent, if the amount that I have to give to them every period is positive, it means that it's a welfare gain. So in this case, it will be 0.5 for the optimal. If it's negative, it means that actually in the economy with rules, you have welfare losses. So thanks for the question. It is important. Um, so basically, what I'm gonna show you now is the transitions for the main macro variables. So for public debt, when what happened is that after the implementation of the rule, so of course debt has to decrease, and in this case, it decreased not only to the level of the debt rule, but also a little bit below the debt rule, because you don't want to be too close to the you don't want to be too close to the debt limit, because maybe COVID happens or a bad shock happens, and then if you are too close, uh, like in this specific model right now, I'm assuming perfect commitment to the debt rule. So that means that the government cannot violate the the debt limit, right? So because of that, the government doesn't want to be too close to the debt limit, because if a bad shock happen, then the government will have to default. So that's why debt decrease, um, and is a little bit far away from the debt limit. In the case of spreads, so basically the spreads were about like 6.5%, or the interest rate was like well, no, the spreads were like 6.5%, and then they decrease around 2.7 after the implementation. Um, then what we observed that happened to capital and GDP is that at the beginning capital decrease, because what I told you, that if you want to pay back debt, you need to get resources from somewhere, right? So capital has to decrease after the implementation of the rule. Investment has to decrease. Sorry. Investment has to decrease. So it decreases in the after the implementation, and then it takes around between 1 and 2 years to go back to normal. Um, so as I say, capital. This is capital. No, this is GDP. Capital also decrease. GDP is close to zero at the beginning, and then you start having a increase in GDP. This is relative to the economy in which there is no fiscal rule. Basically, the probability of default also decrease, because now you have a richer economy with more capital, with lower sovereign spreads, with lower debt. So because of that, the probability of default decrease. And ultimately, at the beginning, as I say, households will have to reduce their consumption because fiscal consolidations can be painful. But then, after the implementation of the rule, the households will be better off, right? Um, so basically, this represent a little bit the dynamics that what happened when you implement the optimal debt rule that we just compute. So basically, you have to decrease debt. How do you decrease debt? Well, you decrease debt by decreasing investment, by decreasing consumption, and because of that, you will be able to reduce the level of spreads, and then the levels of spreads will stay there, which will free up resources in the future and will allow you to accumulate more capital and to achieve higher GDP in the long run. So um, basically, this is a graph that represents what is driving the mechanism or why spreads decrease. And the idea is that with a debt rule, basically what the government is doing is buying commitment in the sense that I'm telling you, the private sector, how much how much debt will be the maximum that I can issue, and that will help to set expectations regarding debt dilution, which is what I mentioned at the beginning, and also the other friction that I mentioned is that lower spreads implies that there will be less on their investment, right? So basically, by having a rule, I can set the expectations to limit the debt dilution, right? And because of that, the 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 expectations of the lenders is that then they can invest more, and because they can invest more, the spreads will be even lower, and that's why overall we face lower spreads in the economy. Um, so yeah, let me skip this. This is a similar exercise with we try with different fiscal rules, but this is a little bit technical, and I think it's better if we just jump to the discussion. Um, oh, wait, no, I don't have the because we do an exercise in which we relax the the commitment, but I think I don't have it here. But overall, the conclusion is that debt limits can generate economic expansion in the long run. So basically, welfare gains come from a significant reduction in spreads, which are driven by the expectations about future borrowing and investment. So again, with a fiscal rule, what the investors know is that the government will issue less debt in the future, right? So also this means that they they don't need to tax that much, and basically this is benefiting the expectations about investment and about future, yeah, and about investment. Um, so we also do a exercise in which we relax a commitment to the rule, and basically we find that the mechanism is the same, but the gains are lower, right? Because the lenders know that at some point the government actually will deviate from the rule. Um, but still there are significant welfare gains, and I mean that's it. So yeah, so please feel free to ask questions, and then we can have a more practical discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the insightful lecture. Well, actually, I have a question before I give it to you guys. Um, I have a question on one of your impulse response function. If you can move back. So yeah, so for the consumption, so it seems that so after starting from the first year, so you settle at a level that's above zero. Does that mean that so since it's a percentage change, so does that mean that the consumption keeps going up, or what is it? Yeah.
This one.
Yeah, you see that after the first year, so it settles at a level so above zero. So does that mean that the consumption keeps going up after?
Yeah, so this is what this is capturing is the percent change relative to the economy without any rule. right? So
Okay.
if you see at -1
Uh-huh.
is zero, right? Because
Yes.
the economy without the rule and the economy that gonna eventually adopt the rule is
Yes.
exactly the same.
Uh-huh.
Then the economy with the rule, like actually has to decrease consumption a lot, right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Um, and then after that, you are always above zero. So basically,
Yeah.
it means that in the after 1 or 2 years of the implementation,
Uh-huh.
you will always be getting more consumption than the economy
Uh-huh.
that didn't implement any rule.
Oh, okay. So gotcha. So it's relative to
Relative to the
the
economy
countries
without the
without.
rule,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Thank you.
all this is relative to the economy without the rule.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. I think now we will start our Q&A session. So if you guys have any questions, please raise your hand. Um, if someone could help with the microphone.
Okay, I would like to thank for the opportunity to be given the chance to ask the question, and I would like to appreciate the insights that Mr. Penelosa has given in this lecture. So I think this is a very opportune moment for me to ask about fiscal consolidation because, if I'm not mistaken, you are Mexican. Yes. In Mexican history, there is two period, which is in 1982 and 1994, which is a huge debt crisis caused by, I think, the drop of oil prices and the devaluation of the peso. So I think my question is more conceptual, not empirical or equation driven. As Mexico has used and implemented trade liberalization, privatization, and a reduced public spending, it resulted in a very high social cost, which caused increased poverty and many other social problems like crime. So my question is, first, does the model account for the many social costs that comes from fiscal consolidation, especially like Mexico? And in Argentina's case, I want to know, like, for example, in 1980s, when Argentina implemented the Spring and Austro Plan, which is a very disciplined and harsh austerity measures, it doesn't resulted in a long-term economic growth. And instead, if I'm not mistaken, in the 2000s, when Kirchner implemented a more interventive measure, it then resulted in economic growth. So does fiscal consolidation really resulted in definite economic growth in the future? I think that's my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, there are many things I want to say. So let me start by saying whether this capture or not the cost of fiscal consolidation. And I think it's very important to say that if someone tells you that fiscal consolidation has no cost in the short run, it will be lying to you. Like fiscal consolidation, it means um, that basically fiscal authority, right? That the government has to increase taxes or reduce spending. And of course, there are going to be losers from this policy, right? Because there are going to be people needing to pay more taxes. So probably this is going to decrease investment in the short run. It's going to reduce economic activity, or probably there are going to be people receiving less social benefits or less transfers. And this will be painful for some households. I think the idea fiscal consolidation and also what we want to show in this is that it's a cost in the short run that might have benefits in the long run, right? Um, and the idea and when we're saying that it has welfare gains, it means that the medium and long term benefits are higher than the short run benefits, right? For example, in the case that the in the case of Argentina, the current president Milei, he won the elections by saying that Argentina didn't have any option but fiscal consolidation because the government spending in Argentina is already very high because they have been going in many crises because inflation is more than 30%. So Sometimes there is no even option of of whether you want to have fiscal consolidation or not. If your public finance are not sustainable, you need to have fiscal consolidation. And even though it will be, for example, in the case of Argentina, it could be very costly. Uh, that is the best option, because if you don't do it, then you are just roll over the problem, and eventually this can become a crisis. No. So in that sense, I would like to emphasize that yes, I mean, fiscal consolidation can be costly, but overall, I believe that in the medium and long term, like the benefits in the medium and long term compensate the cost in the short run. And I think the policy implication of this is try to think about how you reduce, right, the short term cost of fiscal consolidation. And I think, for example, this is not captured in this paper, because we want to be very clear about what we are modeling here. But there is a lot of research on saying, okay, what is the less costly way to achieve a fiscal consolidation? And what we find is that usually is through lowering spending rather than increase taxes, right? Because when you increase taxes, basically you're gonna affect not only the producers but also the whole economy, because the economic activity will decrease. If you reduce spending, of course you're gonna affect some households, but you also need to be very smart about what spending you're gonna reduce, right? Probably you don't reduce transfers to the poorest households, because those are the ones who really need the money. No, probably you reduce subsidies, or probably you reduce I mean, government consumption, other kind of spending that that will have less cost over economic activity and welfare in general. So that will be the point. And this don't really capture the Mexican crisis, because the Mexican crisis was more because of something that is called self-fulfilling crisis. There are good papers about that. I'm happy to recommend you some literature on that. But yeah, hopefully the answer is useful for you.
Thank you for the answer. Is there any other questions from the audience?
All right. Thank you, Agustin. I really enjoyed the presentation. Brought me back to my PhD years. So I have I mean, I congratulate you for writing such a nice paper, especially when you look at Indonesia, for example, and a lot of developing countries. We're so bind to the 60% debt to GDP ratio, which was not actually, I mean, to my personal opinion, it's not very well kind of like thought of. It was something that's taken from Maastricht Treaty in the EU. So it was something just like, oh, okay, for the sake of having that limit, let's put 60%. But if you look at into like the practical, more like realm, then IMF would come to Indonesia and say that, oh, you have this psychological debt limit of 30%. So, we were trying to kind of like get closer and closer into that range. So, for example, during the pandemic, we had the debt to GDP ratio went up a lot. Now the government is starting to like, okay, let's go back to that psychological limit of 30%. Okay, so your paper really give us like a nice idea of like what is an optimal debt level without having to kind of like just focus on like the 60%. I mean, below 60% basically like we're safe legally. That's something that's being written in the law, right? But anyways, I got a lot of like research idea from your presentation, so thank you very much for that. I have several questions regarding like the model itself. First relates to the bond structure, or like the maturity of the maturity structure of the bonds, because governments they can issue like short-term debt, long-term debt, and like the composition of like short-term versus long-term. I feel like there's a lot of literature, paper in the literature talking about how maturity is important in that sense. So how would you incorporate that into your model? And also, I'm not quite understand how the debt affects investment. Is it through like the aggregate demand, or like when the household sees that, you know, there's a possibility of default, lower possibility of default that would affect the investment, that would induce like more investment, you know, in the household decision making. And the last one is, how do you calibrate theta? Because I know that theta is very important parameters in terms of the mechanics of the model. And I think it would be interesting if we can solve the model for several values of thetas. So you can kind of like get a kind of like an interval of the debt limit. So you're not just like giving us like a 44.5%, but it's like, oh, okay, you have uncertainty of what theta is, and then you have also a kind of like an interval for the debt limit, if that's possible. And could it be possible that the theta is endogenous? So, for example, if you're like consistently far away from your debt limit, then you kind of like build up like some sort of credibility that might reduce theta, and the other way around, if that's possible. Thank you.
Thank, thanks a lot for the question. So regarding the debt structure or the debt maturity, if yeah, the question was regarding the debt maturity, right? The first question was regarding debt maturity. Um, I didn't get that question that well. We basically we follow the I think Hachondo Martinez in the way that they model this. So basically, what they assume is so we do have a long-term debt. So basically, it means that the average maturity is captured by what's the parameter? Uh, yeah, I think it should be the gamma. Give me a second. Um, yeah, exactly. So basically, the gamma is what captures the maturity rate, right? And basically, the way that we calibrate the gamma is just by taking the average maturity of debt in Argentina during the period that we are using for calibration. Um, of course, we can try to make this a little bit more complex, but then I mean this is the one of the easiest way to solve this model, and the model is already complex enough to adapt other stuff. So basically, what we are doing here is just calibrating the gamma to capture an average debt maturity of I guess this is like 5 years. So um, um, but that is the main idea. I don't really remember what is the value that we use here, but I guess it's like the average maturity of the Argentinian debt should be like 5 years or something like that, and that's why we are disciplining the parameter gamma. Um, that was the first question. The second one was regarding the investment. Yes. So again, in previous versions of the model, we have something more complex like distortionary taxation or something like that. But then we decide to keep it as simple as possible. So here the main way that debt affect investment is to the government transfers. So the more debt you have, and especially after the implementation of the rule, if you have to decrease debt, basically the way that you have to do that is through by increasing the taxes, right? So if you increase taxes, basically you are taking resources from the households, and basically that will decrease investment, right? This is the first effect, that how reducing debt will decrease investment. And in the future, basically the effect is that since after the implementation of the rule, sorry, since after the implementation of the rule, the spreads are lower, right? Um, Basically, the spreads are lower. The debt that the government has to pay is lower. So basically, also taxes that households have to pay after the implementation of the rule are lower, and these allow households to invest more. So basically, the reduction of spreads implies like a free up of resources that is translated into lower taxes for the households, and this allow for higher investment. So everything is through to basically more debt means more lump sum taxes, right? Which means less investment. Um, Lower spreads and lower debt means that the government needs less taxes to pay back that. So basically, you have more fiscal space, which is translated into less taxes and more investment from the households. And the third question was regarding the calibration. How can you calibrate this for? I think this is one of the questions that I, because at the end of the day, and you as a researcher will understand this, that sometimes you focus a lot on technical issues that the referee will appreciate and you will be able to publish in a good journal. Um, but sometimes you need to think whether you can trust this model to do policy recommendations, right? Like, can I actually take this model and go with the Argentinian government and tell them, hey, you need to put that limit here, otherwise you do something to me? I don't know if I will trust the model that much, right? Because there are many things that you need to take into account, and again, a model is just a simplification of the reality. So definitely, I think something that will be interesting to do. I still don't know how to do that, but it will be, I think, yeah, to calibrate this for different economies and taking into account like basically sources of uncertainty, right? To get more like an estimate of, okay, the rule should be around these levels. But to be honest, I didn't know this psychological limit. So I would say that compared with many of the ways, I mean, the way that currently, or how policymakers decide to adopt rules or to set the debt limits. I think also, I mean, comparing to that, I think this is also a educated guess, right? But of course, it's not a perfect way to set a debt rule. Yeah. Mm. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Is there any more questions from the audience? No? Yeah.
Well, thank you for your presentations. Enjoy it. And then I have more practical questions. Like Pak Gunawan explained in the introductions that the government of Indonesia building a massive project, which is the new capital in Kalimantan. What do you think of the government would do? Do does it tax the people? Like I was very worried about increasing taxes because of this massive project. There are a lot of pros and cons of the building of the project, and some people probably choose we don't need to move the capital because otherwise then we have to pay more taxes in the future. And then the second question is, what is the most optimal course of action of the taxpayers like us? What should we do if the project will be built in the future? What should be what should we anticipate this project? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I'm afraid to talk that much about this because you know more than me, but I will tell you what I know about Indonesia. Um, I mean, one is that if you look at the data, something that I always I'm always surprised about Indonesia is that if you look at infrastructure investment, is one of the highest countries. I mean, the infrastructure investment in Indonesia is among the highest relative to any other country, right? Um, but if you actually look at public investment, at least compared to regional peers like Malaysia, Thailand, actually public investment is relatively low, right? Which means that most of this investment in infrastructure is made by the private sector, right? So I think the Indonesian model is and also another piece of information is that also if you look at the tax revenue in Indonesia comparing with other emerging economies and other regional peers is very low. I think at least the number that I have on top of my head is around 10%, which is very low. So basically, and if you look at the debt, it's also not that bad. Like the debt is okay. So basically, what I think, and actually something that I want to learn more, is about the Indonesian model to finance huge infrastructure projects, because it seems that they are doing through private public sector partnerships, right? So basically, most of this investment it seems to be made by the private sector, because if you look at public investment, if you look at taxation, if you look at debt, then you cannot reconcile the number. Then you cannot explain, okay, how is this financed? So, um, in that sense, I would expect that most of the financing from this incoming project, which is moving the capital to another city, I think it will be involving a lot the private sector. To be honest, I don't know enough about exactly in what terms like this partnership between public and private is done. I would love to learn more about that. But I wouldn't expect that. I mean, I think taxes in Indonesia eventually has to increase, right? Uh, Especially if you look at consumption taxes are also very low. And we know that consumption taxes are less distortionary than direct taxes. So in that sense, I will say I do think taxes will increase eventually, especially consumption taxes. Uh, Maybe independently on whether this project happen or not, just because I do think that the revenue collection from indirect taxes is relatively low. Um, but also, I don't think that this incoming project of moving the capital city to another city will have a lot of, I mean, will have impact or a lot of impact on the on income taxes, for example, because one of the, I mean, the Indonesian model and basically the East Asian model of fiscal policies is betting on economic growth, right? And for economic growth, we cannot increase taxes that much because this gonna damage investment. So I don't think income taxes will increase that much. I do think that the government needs to find ways to increase taxes. So, for example, consumption taxes or probably wealth taxes, right? I mean, in a ways that there is less distortionary. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any more question? No more questions? Well, actually, there are some questions from some of the students who registered for this event. Mm, uh, I'll let you choose one probably. Okay, so it is so The third question from Muhammad Adnan Asidik, is a student from MD FAB UGM. So he was asking how fiscal rules can encourage economic development, especially in alleviating poverty in the long run. So yeah, poverty alleviation.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think I'm gonna take this opportunity to also talk a little bit about how fiscal rules have evolved over time and what are the benefits of fiscal rules, and also where do I think that fiscal rules should go. So basically, in the 90s, like the only countries that actually have adopted fiscal rules by then, it was advanced economies, mainly countries in Europe. But since 2000, there have been a widespread adoption of fiscal rules among emerging economies. And the the fiscal discipline effect of fiscal rules is already something very well studied. So basically, we know that fiscal rules contribute to have lower deficits and to have higher fiscal discipline. Um, but I think fiscal rules can be more than that, and I think this paper is a attempt to show that the benefit of fiscal rules is not only the disciplinary effect, but also can have implications on 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 private investment, capital accumulation, long-term growth. And in that sense, and I was talking with your professor as well about this, I think in the future we can also think about not only, I mean, right now the most popular ones are debt rules and budget balance rules. So basically rules on the deficit. But there are also in some countries examples of expenditure rules, revenue rules, and I think in the future what we should do is to have something that in the literature is called like a medium or long-term fiscal plan, right? Which basically set expectations on, okay, why do I need taxes for? To finance what kind of spending? So if you have specific targets on, okay, in the next 10 years, I want to increase government spending on health and education by 2 points of GDP, then I need to increase taxes. So how I'm gonna collect these resources? So I think that having a plan like that will contribute not only to have a specific development goals, which is the question, right? But also to provide certainty and to provide guidance on exactly how you're gonna collect those taxes in the next 3, 5, 10 years, which will contribute to provide a lot of certainty to private sector. Uh, I think this is something that should be the future of public finance, but of course there is um, for this, which is basically a political economy, right? Because maybe the current government wants to put a fiscal plan, right? But it only gonna be valid until the same government is in power, because when the new government is in power, probably they have different objectives, and then it becomes a little bit more complicated. But I would say that a way to link fiscal rules with development goals is to have a specific targets on the kind of government spending that you want to achieve and how you're gonna finance that specific targets. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Uh, well, I could. Is there any more questions? Oh, yeah, please.
Only one by person, my friend.
Okay, I'm very sorry for asking again. So it is a compilation of questions from my friend also. So and and I can assure that these questions are
Are
very
you sure that you also asked them? The guys go and ask them their questions as well.
again, this question I think is only conceptual, not very question like my lecturers do. So first, I want to know like what is the criterion for a good fiscal rule. The second is there is a study that uh, talks about when how frequent should we change fiscal rules to adapt to new circumstances, and the third is like when, if ever, there's a possibility to break a fiscal rule, for example. That's the three first question, and the last question I think is longer from my friend. I think so. Depth is divided into two: domestic and international, and foreign debt. I'm sorry. Foreign is influenced by the volatility of exchange rate, and domestic debt is different in characteristic with that. So, is there a optimal like the difference between these two types of debt? Does it have an effect on the optimal like distribution of the debt ratio that you've given previously? So yeah, that's the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I should congratulate you or your friends for the questions. So on the first one, it's a good question. So what make a fiscal rule a good or a bad fiscal rule? So basically, what the literature says is that there are three dimensions that are important for a fiscal rule. One is simplicity. How simple is the rule? Like because the simpler is the rule, the easier way for the public to follow, right? So a debt rule of 60% cannot be above 60% of GDP is a very simple rule, and everyone can know whether the government is compelling with the rule or not, right? A very complex rule, for example, in Chile or in other countries that they have rules that are more complex, like it's a rule based on the structural deficit, and so for that you actually need a fiscal council that is tracking whether the fiscal rule is being achieved or not, and there can be more complex rules. So one is that simplicity is one dimension. Uh, the other is sorry simplicity, flexible. So you need a rule that is not too rigid, because another thing that is important for fiscal policy is having a degree of discretionary fiscal policy, right? Because s- it's okay to have rules for everything and to know exactly how you're gonna spend the public money, the government money. Bad things could happen, no? COVID can happen, things can happen. I mean, in Indonesia is a country that is exposed to natural disaster risk. So these kind of things could happen, and they will be ready to to um, to have liquidity funds for this kind of exogenous unexpected shocks. So if you have a very rigid rule, uh, then probably the optimal is to issue more debt to be able to finance a specific spending in a specific situation. But if the rule is too rigid, then you cannot do it, right? And COVID is a perfect example of this. The fiscal rule in Indonesia is such that it has like something that is called a escape clause, right? So basically, in the specific situations, the the country, well, Indonesia in particular, can violate the rule, right? And in COVID, they suspend the rule, right? Because the government need resources to finance fiscal stimulus during COVID. So right now, I forget about the other dimension. Usually simplicity, flexibility, and enforceability, of course. Um, and usually there is a trade-off. It's not a perfect measure, because the more simple it is, maybe it's good for enforceability, but maybe it's not that flexible, right? So if you do it more flexible, maybe you do it a little bit more complex, so it's hard to achieve flexibility. So you is there is no a perfect recipe. I think depends a lot on the context. It's very country specific. Um, but for example, I think the model, at least this chart that I'm very proud about, uh, gives you a very good example of the trade-off that you don't want a rule that is too rigid because then gonna kill you, right? You don't want a rule that is too lacking because then it doesn't have any impact, right? So it should be something in between, right? And most of the work that has been done in the literature is about how to find better fiscal rules. Is a debt rule the best option? Probably no. There are some papers that saying that instead of looking at the level of debt, it will be great to look at the price of the debt, so the sovereign spreads. So basically, what this rule say is that okay, when the price of debt is low, well, then it's good to issue a little bit more debt. When the price of debt is high, maybe you should issue less debt, right? So in that case, the rule is not just a number; it's a function of no, sorry, it's a function of the price of the debt. So I will say the short answer is a good rule is the one that can contribute to have fiscal discipline, that can contribute to have to provide credibility to the public, and a rule that also gives some space for the government and is not too rigid. Okay. This is the first question. The other was regarding the composition of debt, right? Uh, so regarding the composition of debt, definitely it matters. This model, for example, is assuming that everything is like everything is in let's say in dollars, right, or in goods, in bananas. But once that you consider the denominated in domestic or foreign currency, of course, it can have different implications. Um, I I know, for example, for countries in East Asia, like most of the debt is issued in domestic currency, at least for most of the countries. Um, but I will say that the only thing that changes is that when you have most of your debt denominated in foreign currency, then the problem is basically external shocks that can depreciate your currency and suddenly increase a lot your debt, right? When the debt is mostly domestic, then you have different problems. One is that you may have more crowding out effects because it means that someone in your country, like banks or like is lending to the government, and basically these are resources that are not being used for investment, right? Or if the government has a lot of debt denominated in local currency, then there is also possibility to inflate debt, right? Which is what happened a lot, I don't know, in countries like Argentina. So, of course, it depends a lot, but I will say that the general idea is is independent on whether the debt is issued in domestic or local, which is like it's okay to have some debt, especially if you use it wisely. But accumulating a lot of debt is never good because eventually you have to pay, right? And either, I mean, you will pay and you have to achieve fiscal consolidation and this will be painful, or you will have to pay by inflating the debt and inflation is also not good. So I would think that the main lesson is like debt is a resource, is an instrument that you can use it, but use it wisely to finance spending that is actually needed.
Okay, thank you so much. I will have to end our Q&A session. Thank you so much for such an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Well, today's seminar has brought forward some important insights into how fiscal rules and debt management can impact long-term growth, particularly in economies facing sovereign risk. We have learned that limiting debt in the right way can actually foster investment and lead to long-term welfare gains. As we've seen with Indonesia's debt increase, these are not merely theoretical questions. The decisions that government make today about fiscal policy and borrowing will have profound consequences for future growth and economic stability. So with this in mind, I hope that this seminar has provided you with a better understanding of how to navigate these complex challenges, not only as economists, but also as citizens concerned with our nation's fiscal health. Thanks, you all, again for your attention. And I'd like to thank once again Agustin for sharing his expertise with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gunawan, for accompanying us throughout the session. Also, thank you very much to Professor Agustin for the lecture and discussion. As the time already shows 11 a.m., the series of SinarKU activities have come to an end. We would like to thank all attendees who have participated in today's event. We hope that the knowledge we have learned together will be useful and motivate us to explore and learn this topic further. I also would like to remind you that participants are entitled to an e-certificate if they attend the event until the end and fill out the attendance and feedback forms that is presented at the end of this event. Before we close the event, we would like to express our gratitude to Professor Agustin with a gift as a souvenir. I would like to invite Mr. Gumilang Aryo Sahadewo as the Vice Dean for Research, Community Service, Cooperation, and Alumni of Faculty of Economics and Business to the stage to deliver the gift.
So much for the information.
Siapa saya?
I want to sit over there, then we'll take a picture of everyone.
Kameranya bagus. Sekarang we also would like to take a picture with all the attendees and all the lecturers coming today.